The night sky does not hurry, and yet it carries the weight of ages. When you step outside and look upward, you are looking into a mirror that billions of people before you have also seen. Farmers once trusted these same constellations to know when the soil would open for seeds. Sailors once read these same scattered lights to guess where the horizon might carry them. And long before words were written in stone or ink, there were people, unknown to us now, who may have looked at these skies and built their lives around patterns we no longer recognize. It is a quiet thought, not a secret, not even a mystery in the dramatic sense, but a suggestion. What if the world we know is balanced on layers of memory that do not belong to the civilizations we name in our history books? What if there were others before them, builders and dreamers whose names dissolved while their traces remained? Stones fitted too perfectly, myths told across oceans, fragments of maps pointing to coastlines no one should have drawn. These are not answers, but whispers. This is not about proof or certainty. It is about allowing space for the possibility that our story is longer, more complex, more human than we assume. Welcome to Arcane Skies. If you feel like following these questions further, you can like or subscribe, and perhaps share in the comments the place and time where you're listening, adding your voice to this ongoing conversation across distance. When we think of history, we often imagine it as a long line drawn across the page, one event following another, each neatly arranged like beads on a string. But the world beneath our feet, and the ruins scattered across continents, do not always follow that order. Sometimes the layers are misaligned, sometimes the fragments belong to puzzles whose picture we no longer have. In those places, a different kind of story breathes, one that invites us to question whether the timeline we accept is only the surface of something deeper. Imagine walking through an old city where centuries have stacked themselves invisibly, each generation building over the one before. In Rome, for instance, churches stand over temples, and beneath them lie the remains of houses far older still. In Mexico City, cathedrals rest on Aztec foundations, and beneath those traces of people even earlier. This is the visible truth of how civilizations overwrite each other. Yet there are places where the layers do not simply represent time passing in order. Instead, they suggest that the first builders may not have been the ones we assume. Enormous stone blocks, cut so precisely that even today a razor blade could not slip between them, sit at the base of walls whose upper sections are rougher, less exact, and clearly built later. It is as though the most advanced work came first and the imitations followed. You can find this pattern in distant parts of the world, from the Andes to the Mediterranean, from the Middle East to remote Pacific islands. Archaeologists often explain it as simple reuse. Later cultures found abandoned stones and placed their own structures on top. It is a logical and practical explanation. Yet the question lingers: who carved those foundation stones in the first place? Why were they so much larger, heavier, and more finely fitted than the blocks above them? Why did precision appear first, followed by cruder work? These are not questions with easy answers. Instead, they open a doorway to wonder, to the possibility that skills existed, were lost, and then re-remembered in fragments by the people we credit with invention. Think of a craftsman whose descendants no longer know the secret of his technique. The objects remain, beautiful, exact, durable, but the knowledge fades when not passed on. Later generations may imitate, but the original mastery is gone. History shows us that knowledge is fragile in this way. Entire arts have vanished. Roman concrete with its resilience against the sea, the Greek fire that terrified enemies on the water, the methods of Damascus steel that produced blades with mysterious strength and beauty. If such skills could vanish within the last 2,000 years, why not imagine that other knowledge, far older, also slipped away, leaving behind only the whisper of its results? Picture yourself at a ruin where tourists wander with cameras and guides recite dates, names, dynasties. You stand before a wall, its lower half made of blocks taller than a person, each interlocked in curves and angles, like pieces of a massive stone puzzle, while above it rough stones are stacked more loosely, joined with mortar. The guide explains the later builders, but in the silence between the words you might sense something more. You might feel that the real story is not what is being told, but what cannot be explained. The foundation looks older than the city around it, older than the people who are credited with its construction. And in that gap between the visible and the knowable, imagination steps in. Imagination is not the enemy of truth. It is the companion that allows us to look at evidence and say, what if? What if this precision belonged to a group we do not know? A group that never wrote their names, whose myths dissolved before the first scribes etched clay tablets? What if they were not empire builders, but wanderers, artisans, stoneworkers, navigators whose knowledge passed quietly from place to place, without ever anchoring itself to a kingdom's power? Influence does not need monuments to endure. A single method of cutting stone, a single way of aligning a wall with the sun, can echo for centuries. Farmers plant seeds without knowing who first domesticated them. Sailors steer by constellations without knowing which culture first mapped them. These are the invisible fingerprints of the past, pressed so deeply into daily life that we no longer see them as inventions at all. In this way, the great stones are not simply relics of construction. They are the memory of hands we cannot name. They invite us to consider how fragile memory really is. Without writing, people told their histories aloud, around fires, across seasons. Each telling was a chance for change, a chance for exaggeration, a chance for forgetting. In 3 or 4 generations, the memory of an extraordinary event could shift from fact to story, then from story to legend, and finally into myth. By the time it reached us, it would carry no clear record of who, where, or when, only the shape of something once real. And so the ruins and the myths stand together, half shadows of what once was, each incomplete, each waiting for the other to fill in the silence. Think about the voices that never reached us because the medium was too fragile. Wood rots, cloth decays, clay breaks, papyrus burns. Even stone wears away under wind and rain. If an entire culture lived in a forest of heavy rains and built mostly with timber, their world might dissolve within centuries, leaving no trace except in the memory of their neighbours. If they wrote on leaves, bark, or skin, their words would vanish, and yet fragments of their knowledge might survive indirectly. Another culture might copy their farming technique or adopt their navigation method without knowing the origin. Over thousands of years, the link would vanish, leaving us with the puzzle of influence without source. The temptation is to dismiss this line of thought as speculation. But history itself is filled with rediscoveries that once seemed impossible. There was a time when the idea of humans building monuments before ancient Egypt was unthinkable. Until Göbekli Tepe appeared, 12,000 years old, carved with animals and aligned with the sky, forcing scholars to rethink the timeline of civilization. There was a time when seafaring across the Pacific was thought beyond the capacity of early cultures, until Polynesian navigation proved it had been done for centuries with skill and precision. Each discovery pushes the boundary of what we consider possible. Each one reminds us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, only the result of time's uneven hand. So when we see foundation stones that do not match their walls, when we hear myths of strangers teaching forgotten arts, when we notice symbols that appear across continents, the question is not whether we can prove an unknown civilization existed. The question is whether we can allow space for the possibility, because the possibility itself changes the way we see. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line, but a weave of rises and falls, of lights burning bright, and then going out, of skills forgotten and found again. And in that weave may lie entire cultures, whose names never reached us, but whose shadows still fall across our world, faint but undeniable. It is often said that stories are the oldest inheritance we carry, more enduring in their way than monuments of stone. A temple may crumble, but a story, passed from mouth to ear across generations, can travel farther than any caravan. In those stories we find fragments that seem strangely practical, details that appear too exact for pure invention. Across the world, myths tell of floods that covered entire valleys, of strangers who arrived from faraway lands bringing knowledge, of cities that vanished beneath the sea. It is easy to read them as metaphor or entertainment, and often they are, but woven into their fabric might be kernels of truth. If you listen carefully, you notice that myths separated by oceans sometimes share the same spine. A great flood cleanses the world, a wandering figure teaches agriculture, a city is swallowed by water or sand. How does the same pattern surface in places with no apparent connection? One answer is coincidence, human imagination responding in similar ways to the universal forces of nature. But another answer, more intriguing, is that these myths preserve the memory of events experienced by people long before writing existed, memories carried like seeds into the soil of later cultures. Imagine a people whose homeland was taken by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. They flee in small groups, carrying little but their memories and their skills. They reach new lands, tell their hosts about the flood, about the world they lost, and teach them the techniques they remember, how to grow certain crops, how to shape stone, how to track the sky. Their story becomes part of the host's mythology, stripped of names, shaped by time, transformed into something half literal, half symbolic. Thousands of years later, all that remains is the myth, yet hidden in it is the outline of a vanished culture. This is not proof, but it is possibility. Take the flood myths as an example. Nearly every region has them. In Mesopotamia, a hero builds an ark and survives the waters sent by the gods. In India, a fish warns of rising seas. In the Americas, stories speak of mountains becoming islands in a world drowned. Even in Australia, Aboriginal traditions describe coastlines as they once were 7,000 years ago, before rising seas erased them. These stories linger with remarkable precision, describing bays, inlets, and valleys that no longer exist but can now be confirmed through geology. That kind of endurance suggests that oral tradition, despite its tendency to embellish, can also preserve a surprising amount of factual memory. If this is true, then perhaps other myths, those of lost lands like Atlantis, Kumari Kandam, or Lemuria, might also preserve echoes of places erased by time. Maybe they were not the vast utopias described by later storytellers, but smaller thriving cultures that left a strong impression on those who survived them. A single city swallowed by a tsunami could spark tales that, retold over centuries, expanded into stories of entire continents disappearing beneath the sea. The exaggeration may grow, but the seed is still there. A real place, a real disaster, a real memory. Then there are the myths of visitors. Across continents, cultures tell of strangers who came from far away, taught important skills, and then vanished. Some describe them as gods, others as wise men, others as nameless outsiders. In the Andes, legends tell of Viracocha, a bearded figure who emerged from the sea to teach building and farming. In Mesopotamia, there is Oannes, a being from the water who instructed people in writing and science. In Polynesia, there are tales of navigators arriving from distant islands, sharing knowledge of the stars and the seas. These stories are diverse, yet their pattern is familiar. Someone comes, shares, disappears. Were they invented from nothing, or were they distant echoes of contact with cultures more advanced than the ones who remembered them? The question is not easy to answer, but if even a few of these myths hold truth, then they might point to a network of encounters we have forgotten. Knowledge does not need empires to travel. It can move quietly through stories, through marriages, through trade, through the journeys of wanderers. Over time, the origin is forgotten, but the gift remains. What makes myths powerful is not that they are precise history, but that they can carry fragments of memory disguised as legend. When a people remembers a stranger teaching them how to plant at the right season, or how to read the sky, they may remember that teaching as divine, miraculous. But beneath the divine, there may have been a person, a visitor from elsewhere, whose knowledge was practical, not magical. The myth becomes the cloak, but the knowledge is the treasure inside. And myths are not only about gods and floods, they also encode subtle observations about the natural world. Some myths mark the cycles of stars, the positions of constellations, the timings of eclipses. By tracing those astronomical references, researchers can sometimes date the stories themselves. A tale of a star's rising may point to a time thousands of years before it shifted in the sky due to precession. This means some myths may be far older than the cultures that wrote them down. They are vessels carrying messages from deep time. Think of myths as the memory of humanity whispered through generations. They distort, yes, but they do not vanish. They keep alive the possibility that events we cannot otherwise document did, in some form, happen. They are the invisible bridge across eras. If ruins are the bones of forgotten civilizations, then myths are their voices, altered but not entirely silenced. So when we listen to a story about a city beneath the waves, or a hero who ruled for centuries, or a visitor from the sea who brought fire and seed, perhaps we should not ask only if it is literally true. Perhaps the better question is, what memory does it hide? What fragment of real experience survives within its exaggerated shell? The world we inherit is not just made of stone and soil, but of tales that travelled across time, like migrating birds, always moving, always reshaping, but never fully lost. And in those tales may lie the faint fingerprints of civilizations that once lived, once thrived, and once shaped the very foundations of the story we think is ours. Stone does not lie, but it does not speak in full sentences either. It endures, holding shapes long after words and stories have faded, and in those shapes we find clues that unsettle the neatness of the timelines we imagine. Across the world, walls and foundations appear where the lower courses of masonry are monumental in scale, blocks so vast that their presence alone feels improbable. These stones are cut with such accuracy that the joints are invisible, and yet stacked above them are layers of rougher, smaller work, clearly belonging to a later people with less skill or less knowledge of the older methods. To walk beside such walls is to feel time folding strangely, as though the beginning were more advanced than the middle. Archaeologists, cautious by necessity, often explain this with practical reasoning. The later builders reused what was available, dragging immense blocks from earlier ruins and setting their own constructions atop them. It is an explanation that satisfies logic, but it does not erase the deeper question. If those massive foundations were indeed the work of an earlier people, who were they? And why do their work seem to exceed the capacities of those who came after? You can see this puzzle in Cusco, where walls of perfectly fitted polygonal stones form the base of later Inca structures. You see it in Baalbek in Lebanon, where three enormous blocks known as the Trilithon each weigh more than 800 tons, and yet rest aligned in a foundation beneath Roman construction. You see it in Egypt, where temples were raised on platforms whose stonework is older than the inscriptions above. It is a pattern too widespread to ignore. Some scholars suggest it is evidence of technological leaps, others that it is simply resourcefulness. But for the curious mind, it suggests that knowledge might once have been more advanced, then forgotten, then partially remembered in imitation. Consider what it means to move a block weighing hundreds of tons without cranes, without industrial steel, without wheels strong enough to bear the load. Today, such feats require months of planning, specialized machinery, and careful engineering. To imagine them accomplished with simple ropes and manpower is difficult, though not impossible. Yet when the blocks are cut with angles and curves that interlock precisely, the challenge becomes even greater. Each joint is unique, each surface shaped to fit its neighbour with uncanny accuracy, creating walls that have withstood centuries of earthquakes. The Inca called such walls works of their ancestors, and perhaps they were. But what if those ancestors belong not to the Inca alone, but to a much older stratum of humanity, one whose knowledge left no record except in stone? Even the erosion of these stones raises questions. At places like the Sphinx enclosure in Giza, weathering patterns suggest water erosion far older than the desert climate would allow, hinting at construction in an age when rain still fell upon the plateau. If true, it would push the monument back thousands of years earlier than the dynasties that claimed it. The mainstream debates continue, and no consensus settles the matter, but the mere presence of the debate illustrates how fragile our certainties are. Stone does not give us dates, it only gives us forms, and in those forms we must search for echoes of lost methods and forgotten hands. The silence of the stones is not empty, it is filled with patterns that repeat across continents. In Peru and in the Mediterranean, the same style of polygonal masonry appears, with blocks locking together in irregular but exact shapes. In Egypt and in Mesopotamia, platforms of cyclopean scale underlie later, more delicate work. Even in the Pacific, at Nan Madol, a city built of basalt logs on coral reefs, the echo of impossible construction lingers. Were these similarities independent inventions, the natural solutions of human ingenuity confronted with heavy stone? Or are they fingerprints, the repeating signs of knowledge, carried across oceans, taught and retaught until the origin was forgotten? Think for a moment about how knowledge travels. A single artisan may share his method with an apprentice, who then carries it to a new place, adapting it, reshaping it. After a few generations, the method survives, but the name of its originator does not. If this happens within a single lifetime, imagine it across centuries. Imagine it across continents. A technique for cutting stone, a way of aligning buildings with the sun, a method for transporting weight. These can travel quietly, invisibly, until they seem like spontaneous inventions in multiple places. But perhaps they are not spontaneous at all. Perhaps they are the shadows of a network long dissolved. We like to think of progress as a steady climb, but the stones suggest a different rhythm. They suggest surges of brilliance followed by periods of decline, where later builders could not equal the work of those before. They suggest that the knowledge to move and shape such masses existed, then slipped away, then left behind only admiration and myth. It is not hard to see how myths of giants arise when standing before such walls. If the living cannot explain the dead, imagination supplies beings of greater strength, of divine skill, of forgotten ages when humans were closer to gods. The myth preserves the awe, but perhaps behind the awe was once a real technique, practical but extraordinary, now vanished from memory. The stones also speak through their alignments. Many of these ancient foundations point to solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. The precision of their orientation shows long observation of the heavens, careful integration of astronomy into architecture. It means that whoever placed them valued the sky, wove its cycles into the very foundations of their lives. This is knowledge both practical and symbolic. To mark the sun's movement is to control planting and harvest, but it is also to connect heaven and earth, to anchor a community's sense of time. That this precision appears in the oldest layers suggests again that those early builders held skills not easily dismissed. In our own time, we measure, we survey, we photograph. Yet even with satellites above us, we still stumble upon ruins hidden in jungle, foundations buried under sand, structures mistaken for natural formations. How many more stones wait beneath forests, deserts, and seas? How many more foundations lie unseen, their silence unbroken until chance uncovers them? Each discovery has the potential to alter the picture we think we know. Each one might whisper of a hand we cannot name, a culture we do not remember, a story waiting to be told, not with words but with blocks fitted too tightly for time to dismantle. To stand among these stones is to feel humility. They remind us that we are not the peak of history, but one moment within its long, uneven waves. They remind us that people before us, nameless and invisible now, achieved works that still puzzle us. And they remind us that forgetting is easier than we think, that whole techniques, whole traditions can vanish while the products endure. The stones endure, the knowledge does not. And in that gap lies the possibility of civilizations unseen. Their voice is gone, but their fingerprints press deep into the earth. If stone is the memory of hands, then maps are the memory of journeys. To trace a line across a surface, to say, this river flows here, this mountain rises there, this coastline curves in such a way, is to capture not only a landscape, but the movement of people within it. We tend to imagine maps as a product of literate societies, as parchment or paper crowded with neat lines and labels, but the impulse to represent space is far older. It surfaces in carvings, in clay tablets, in arrangements of sticks and shells used by Pacific navigators to model currents and islands. When we look at these early representations, we sometimes find details that unsettle us. Coastlines drawn too accurately for the time, islands placed in positions not thought to be reached until millennia later, or even landforms sketched as they might have appeared before the seas rose at the end of the Ice Age. Such anomalies raise the same quiet question that the stones ask: who saw this first and how? One of the most debated examples is a 16th century map known as the Piri Reis, a compilation drawn by an Ottoman admiral who claimed to have copied from older sources. On it, the coast of South America is shown with striking fidelity, And more curiously, a southern landmass appears, where Antarctica lies, depicted without the ice that now buries it. Explanations vary. Perhaps it is a distorted rendering of South America, extended too far. Perhaps it is the result of accumulated sailors' tales reaching farther than we thought. Or perhaps it reflects a memory of geographic knowledge much older than the Renaissance, preserved through copies of copies long after the original makers were gone. The map itself cannot tell us which, it can only pose the question. Elsewhere, in the Pacific, navigators created stick charts that look abstract to an untrained eye, delicate lattices of palm ribs and shells. But to those who understood them, each curve represented a swell, each intersection a current, each shell an island. With them, sailors could cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean, guided not by compass but by the feel of the waves against the hull and the memory of patterns taught by elders. This knowledge did not require writing. It required training, patience, and trust in tradition. If such sophistication existed in one part of the world, who is to say it did not exist elsewhere, in forms we have yet to recognize? A map need not survive as ink on parchment. It can survive as a story of how long the journey takes, as a chant marking islands in sequence, as a monument aligned with the rising sun that tells you when to depart. In parts of Europe and the Middle East, carvings have been found that resemble bird's-eye layouts of valleys and rivers, etched into stone thousands of years before aerial views were possible. Without captions, we cannot be certain they are maps, yet the resemblance is striking. They suggest that people wanted to represent space visually, to share knowledge of how the land lay. A map like this is not just a tool, it is a story flattened into geometry, a way of saying, we have been here, we have seen this, and we remember. And sometimes, when those depictions line up too closely with reality, we are left wondering how far the makers travelled and what traditions of observation they inherited. Think for a moment of what is required to produce a map of any accuracy. One must travel, measure, return, compare. One must transmit that information clearly enough for another person to use it. It is a collective act, not the work of one mind, but of many, sustained across time. That such acts existed in antiquity is beyond doubt. The open question is how much farther they reached than we assume. Did sailors hug coastlines? Or did some cross open seas long before the evidence we accept says they could? Did traders move along familiar routes only? Or did a few venturesome groups mark out lands no one expected them to know? Each anomalous map fragment, each unexpected geographic detail, teases us with the possibility that the world was knit together by invisible threads long before history recorded it. Consider the possibility that ancient maps have simply not survived. Unlike stone, which endures, most mapping materials were fragile: bark, cloth, animal skin, papyrus. A few centuries in damp earth or salt air, and they're gone. That we have any at all is the miracle, and if those few already show anomalies, what might the lost ones have revealed? Imagine a culture whose pride lay not in stone monuments, but in charts of sea and sky. If those charts were copied a handful of times before vanishing, the tradition could disappear without a trace, leaving us with myths of travellers and a handful of puzzling maps in later hands. Sometimes, maps are hidden in places we do not expect. The layout of certain ancient sites mirrors constellations above, suggesting that the builders intended them as reflections of the heavens. At Nazca in Peru, lines stretch across the desert, forming figures only visible from the air, perhaps a kind of star chart made on Earth. At other sites, Monuments align with the horizon at solstices and equinoxes, turning the land itself into a calendar. In these cases, the map is not something you hold in your hands. It is something you walk through, an architecture of space and time combined. These spatial arrangements carry meaning beyond utility. They tell us that people long ago had both the curiosity and the discipline to map not just the land but the sky, to anchor their lives in a geography cosmic as well as earthly. When we compare maps and myths, a pattern emerges. The stories tell of lands lost to water, and the maps hint at coastlines that match those before the seas rose. The stories speak of voyages, and the maps show islands placed where no known culture had yet gone. The stories of strangers bringing knowledge echo the practical instructions encoded in navigation charts. Taken together, they do not prove a forgotten civilization, but they open the door to imagining one. A people who valued movement, who traced the edges of the world as they knew it, and who passed that knowledge along until it was absorbed into others' traditions. It is tempting to think of our present as the pinnacle of mapping, with satellites and GPS, but even now, vast stretches of ocean floor remain unmapped in detail. Dense jungles conceal entire cities from our satellites. Deserts cover settlements with shifting sands. If so much remains hidden today, with all our technology, how much more might have been hidden thousands of years ago? The possibility is sobering. It suggests that the fragments we call anomalies may be only the faintest glimpses of a far larger body of knowledge, one that rose and fell long before us, one that whispers still in the lines of old charts and the memories of storytellers. And so the question lingers, when we see a map that should not exist, are we looking at coincidence, at imagination, at misinterpretation, or at this surviving echo of eyes that once saw farther than we give them credit for? A coastline carved into stone, a pattern of islands marked with shells, a myth that recalls a drowned valley. Each is a fragment of the same puzzle. And like the stones beneath later walls, they hint at layers of human history beneath the one we think we know, a history that may stretch back farther, reach wider, and remind us that the world has always been larger than the story we tell about it. To walk through the ruins of an ancient city is to feel as though you're moving through layers of time that do not always belong to the same story. A cracked stone stair may lead to a temple whose foundations are older than the civilization that worshipped there. A street paved in rough cobbles may lie above the carved flagstones of an earlier settlement, itself resting on still older structures. Archaeology calls this stratigraphy, the stacking of human presence over centuries. Yet sometimes the layers resist easy explanation, as though the builders of different eras were not simply replacing what came before, but inheriting fragments of knowledge they did not fully understand. In those moments, it seems possible that we are glimpsing the faint outlines of civilizations whose names have vanished, but whose echoes remain. Consider the city of Troy, where 9 layers of settlement lie one atop another, each destroyed and rebuilt. To the visitor, it is simply a hill, but within it are centuries of lives compressed into strata. We can read some of them, identify the pottery, the walls, the weapons, but others remain elusive. Who were the first to build here, and why did their work become the foundation for so many who followed? The answer is not always clear, and in that uncertainty lingers the possibility of a forgotten people whose skills or choices set patterns others later copied. This pattern repeats elsewhere, from the mounds of Mesopotamia to the buried tells of Anatolia and the layered temples of Central America. In each case, the visible ruins are only the latest chapter. Beneath them are prologues we can barely decipher. It is not only the presence of layers that intrigues, but their inconsistencies. Sometimes the deepest level seems to hold the most advanced stonework, while the upper layers grow simpler. At other times, materials appear out of sequence, a tool or shard in a stratum older than it should be. Archaeologists, cautious, often attribute these to disturbances, erosion, burrowing animals, later digging. These explanations are valid, but they also remind us how fragile the record is. A single misplaced object can shift an entire narrative. And when enough anomalies appear, scattered across the world, they begin to suggest that our timeline is not as fixed as we imagine. Imagine if an unknown civilization had flourished in wood and earth, leaving behind cities that melted into the ground. In a few centuries, almost nothing would remain. Later, peoples might settle on the same site, building with stone or clay, leaving ruins that survived. To us, the stone appears to be the beginning, but perhaps it was only the middle. The true beginning may have vanished into soil, remembered only through myths of earlier inhabitants. In this way, entire cultures could be swallowed, leaving only faint impressions beneath later layers. The silence of absence becomes part of the story. There are also the objects that surface where they should not. Tools too advanced for their stratum, ornaments made of materials sourced from lands thought unreachable at the time, bones suggesting human presence earlier than our models allow. These so-called out-of-place artifacts attract both fascination and skepticism. Some are explained by misidentification, others by natural mixing of layers. Yet some remain stubbornly out of joint, resisting neat categorization. When they do, they stand as reminders that history is not a seamless line, but a patchwork of fragments, many of them frayed, some missing altogether. Think of the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off Greece more than a century ago. At first, it looks like corroded bronze, unremarkable among the cargo. Only later did scholars realize it was a device of astonishing complexity, a kind of analog computer capable of predicting eclipses and planetary positions. It dates to more than 2,000 years ago, and yet nothing of similar complexity appears for another millennium. Was it an isolated brilliance, the work of a genius lost to time? Or was it the surviving relic of a tradition we no longer recognize? The object alone cannot answer. It is a whisper from the past, remarkable precisely because it stands out so sharply against the background of what we think we know. When we consider such anomalies, we face a choice. We can dismiss them as errors or coincidences, or we can allow them to suggest that there is more to the story. The second path does not mean abandoning reason. It means acknowledging that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that history is a vast puzzle with most of its pieces missing, and that sometimes the pieces we do find hint at pictures different from the one we expect. The buried layers of cities also remind us of how much has yet to be uncovered. Beneath the streets of modern towns lie ruins untouched. Beneath fields, beneath forests, beneath sand, whole settlements remain invisible until chance or technology reveals them. Drought may lower a lake and expose the outlines of a village. A new road may cut through a hill and uncover walls. A survey plane may notice faint patterns in crops that trace the streets of a long-vanished town. Each discovery shifts the boundaries of our knowledge, sometimes by centuries, sometimes by millennia. It is humbling to realize how thin our record really is. Written history covers only the last 5,000 years, and even that is fragmented. Before writing, the record depends on what survives, and survival is uneven, cruelly selective. A city of wood in the tropics might vanish completely, while a stone foundation in a desert remains. We build our understanding from these survivals, but they are not a balanced sample. They are accidents, and accidents can mislead as much as they reveal. So when we look at the layered ruins of the world, perhaps we should not see them only as the traces of known civilizations stacked in order. Perhaps we should also see them as palimpsests, where unknown authors once wrote before their words were erased. The faint indentations of their writing may remain, visible only if we look closely, but enough to suggest that another hand once held the stylus. The cities we know may stand atop cities we do not, and those unseen cities may themselves rest on foundations older still, until we reach a depth where stone becomes story, and story dissolves into silence. The ground beneath us is not solid in the way we imagine. It is layered with memory, some remembered, some forgotten, some erased by time. To dig into it is to risk unsettling the stories we tell about ourselves. But perhaps that is the value of these ruins. They remind us that history is not fixed, that what we think of as beginnings may only be middles, that what we call the first may in truth be the echo of something older. And in that possibility lies the quiet thrill of discovery, the sense that even in a world mapped and studied, mysteries still breathe beneath our feet. There is a certain stillness that comes when you stand before a great monument, not only because of its scale, but because of the questions it carries. The pyramids of Egypt are perhaps the most familiar of these, yet familiarity does not strip them of their strangeness. You may have seen them countless times in books or on screens, but when you stand at their base, each block higher than your head, the abstraction dissolves into physical weight. The stones are massive, hundreds of tons in some cases, and they rise into a geometry so precise that even now, under the erosion of millennia, their lines cut sharply against the horizon. People ask how they were built, but beneath that question lies another. Why were they built in this way, at this time, with this mastery? Official explanations tell us of ramps, labour forces, and decades of careful planning. These are not implausible, but they are not complete either. They explain the mechanics, but not the vision. What kind of society chooses to invest such staggering resources into structures that serve no obvious practical function? Tombs, we are told, but even that answer feels partial. A tomb can be a chamber in the earth, a mound, a temple of modest size. Why pyramids of such enormity, aligned so precisely to the stars, incorporating proportions that suggest advanced mathematics and astronomy? To explain the how is not the same as explaining the why, and in that gap speculation thrives. Step inside the Great Pyramid, and the sense of mystery deepens. The passages narrow, the ceilings press low, the air grows still. It is not a space designed for comfort or ritual gatherings. It is a machine of stone, a series of chambers aligned with uncanny precision. The King's Chamber, built from massive granite blocks transported from hundreds of kilometres away, sits at the heart of this machine, its ceiling slabs weighing dozens of tons. Above it, hidden until rediscovery, are relieving chambers that distribute weight in a manner both practical and ingenious. Yet the builders left no instructions, no texts carved into the walls to explain their choices. The silence of those stones speaks louder than inscriptions could. Theories multiply in that silence. Some imagine lost technologies, forgotten machines that could lift and place stones with ease. Others suggest knowledge inherited from an earlier age, preserved through myth until it found expression in architecture. Even those who resist such speculations admit that the pyramids stand at the beginning of Egyptian civilization, not at its height. It is as though Egypt appeared fully formed, capable of feats that later generations did not match with the same precision. Normally we expect civilizations to grow gradually, to progress from simple beginnings to greater complexity. Here the trajectory feels reversed with a burst of genius at the start, followed by centuries of refinement that never again reach the same monumental clarity. There is also the question of alignment. The pyramids are not scattered randomly across the desert, but arranged with extraordinary care. Their sides align closely with the cardinal directions. Their placement mirrors patterns seen in the stars. The constellation of Orion, associated with Osiris, the god of rebirth, appears to echo in the layout of the pyramids at Giza. Whether this was deliberate or coincidental, it ties the monuments to the heavens in a way that transcends mere architecture. They are not only tombs, but cosmic markers bridging earth and sky. To understand them fully, we may need to think not only in terms of engineering, but in terms of cosmology, myth, and memory. One might ask how much of this alignment is intentional, and how much we project backward with modern eyes. Yet ancient peoples were attentive to the skies in ways we can scarcely imagine. Without artificial light, the night sky was a living presence, a calendar, a map, a storybook written in shifting constellations. To align monuments with those lights was not a quirk but a natural act of connection. What remains remarkable is the precision, the mathematical skill that allowed such alignments to be realized on a monumental scale. To achieve this requires more than faith, it requires knowledge. Some scholars propose that this knowledge was simply the fruit of careful observation over generations. Watch the stars long enough, measure their risings and settings, and patterns emerge. From those patterns, a system of mathematics can grow. Others suggest that such knowledge appears too quickly, as though inherited from an earlier source. In the myths of Egypt itself, there are hints of earlier ages, of a time when gods walked among men, when knowledge was bestowed rather than discovered. Myths are not literal, but they can encode memories, compressing centuries into stories that survive when records do not. Perhaps those myths carry echoes of a forgotten tradition, one that found material form in stone. To walk away from the pyramids is to carry a paradox. On the one hand, they are undeniably products of human effort, the result of hands and tools, planning and perseverance. On the other hand, they seem almost out of place in their own time, as though they belong to an earlier or different chapter of human history. This tension fuels the sense of mystery. They stand as anchors of certainty. The stones are there, real and solid, yet at the same time, they destabilize our certainty about the path of civilization. If such feats were possible so long ago, what else might have been possible that left no trace? The desert itself adds to the enigma. Sand covers, sand reveals. Just as the pyramids survived, other structures may lie buried still, waiting to shift the narrative. Satellite surveys already hint at substructures beneath the sands, outlines of walls, buried streets. The desert preserves by hiding, keeping secrets until chance or persistence brings them back into the light. Each discovery reminds us that what we see now is only part of the story. And so the pyramids remain not simply monuments, but questions in stone. They invite awe, but more than that, they invite humility. We cannot yet claim to know fully why they were built, how their builders conceived them, or what knowledge guided their hands. We can measure, we can analyze, we can model ramps and levers, but the vision behind the act remains beyond reach. perhaps that is why they endure in our imagination. They are not only relics of a past age, but reminders of the possibility that human history contains depths we have not yet sounded. To stand before them is to feel that history is not a line, but a horizon, one that recedes as we approach, always promising more beyond. The pyramids mark that horizon, fixed in stone, yet shifting in meaning, monuments not only to the dead kings within, but to the living questions that surround them. If the pyramids of Egypt speak through their silence, then the ruins of Mesopotamia whisper through fragments. The land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, was once a cradle of human settlement, where villages grew into cities and cities into kingdoms. Here writing was first pressed into clay, the wheel was first turned, and codes of law were carved for all to see. Yet for all these innovations, what remains most striking are the traces that hint at a deeper strangeness. Ziggurats rising as stairways toward heaven, myths that seem to echo other myths across oceans, and sudden collapses that feel less like endings and more like vanishings. Imagine walking across the plains of southern Iraq, where heat shimmers above the earth and the outlines of ancient foundations emerge from dust. The ziggurat of Ur stands restored in part, its steep steps ascending toward what was once a temple at its summit. Unlike the smooth triangles of Egyptian pyramids, ziggurats rise in tiers, like mountains carved into steps. They were not tombs but platforms, designed to lift rituals closer to the sky. The people who built them called these places houses of the gods, but one can also see in them a profound expression of longing, a desire to bridge the distance between earth and heaven. The myths that accompanied these structures tell of beginnings and floods, of gods who measured the heavens and set destinies. The epic of Gilgamesh, carved into tablets thousands of years ago, speaks of a great flood that wiped away the world, a survivor who built a vessel, and a dove released to find dry land. This story is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in Hebrew scripture, in Greek myth, in tales from India, and even from distant Pacific islands. How does the same motif echo so widely? Is it coincidence, or does it preserve memory of a catastrophe so ancient that its story scattered with migrating peoples, embedded into every culture that carried it forward? Archaeology offers evidence that massive floods did sweep across Mesopotamia in deep antiquity. Layers of silt, sudden breaks in habitation, deposits that suggest towns swallowed and rebuilt. Yet to reduce the myth to a mere echo of geology may be too simple. Myths are never just reports, they are frameworks of meaning. The flood stories are less about water than about survival, about the fragility of human order and the hope of renewal. Still, the repetition of these stories across continents invites us to wonder whether memory itself can survive in myth longer than in stone. Another layer of mystery lies in the astronomical knowledge woven into Mesopotamian culture. The Babylonians charted planetary motions with remarkable accuracy, recording eclipses and predicting cycles with a precision that surprises even now. Their observations form the basis of what we call astrology today, though originally it was less about personal destiny and more about reading signs in the sky that might guide kings and empires. How did this meticulous watching of the heavens begin? Some argue it was simply necessity, born of farming cultures who needed calendars. Others suggest that the intensity and complexity of their charts imply an inheritance, as though they were continuing a tradition already old in their own time. The ziggurats themselves may have served as observatories. Rising above the flat plains, their platforms would have given clearer views of the stars. Imagine priests or scholars climbing the steps at night, recording the slow march of constellations, timing the rise of Venus, calculating the intervals of the moon. Knowledge grew from patience, but the question remains, how quickly did it grow and why here? It is tempting to think of Mesopotamia as a beginning, but beginnings are rarely so abrupt. What if it was not a start, but a continuation, a resurgence of something older, reframed in clay and brick rather than in stone? Even their myths suggest an awareness of cycles of civilizations rising and falling, like the stars they tracked. Kings boasted of ruling for thousands of years in the earliest lists, reigns so long they defy literal belief. Were these exaggerations symbols of greatness or remnants of another kind of timekeeping, one that stretched memory into the mythic? These numbers, combined with tales of knowledge bestowed by figures like Oannes, the fish-clad teacher who rose from the sea to instruct humanity, hint at traditions of forgotten teachers. Whether real or imagined, these figures function as placeholders for lost origins. Then comes the collapse. The cities of Mesopotamia did not endure as the pyramids did. They fell to invaders, to shifting rivers, to soil exhaustion, to political upheaval. Yet their knowledge did not vanish, it migrated. The Greeks inherited astronomical tables, the Hebrews preserved flood stories, the Persians absorbed systems of divination. The cradle of civilization became a network of dispersals. From these fragments, later cultures built their own structures of meaning. But the question persists, how much was lost in that dispersal? For every tablet that survives, how many dissolved in rain or crumbled to dust? For every myth retold, how many were forgotten, leaving only faint echoes in other traditions? When you stand at the base of a ziggurat, you feel both presence and absence. The bricks are there, sun-baked and solid, but the temples above them are gone. The rituals once performed have vanished, leaving only outlines. The silence of those ruins is not the same as the silence of the pyramids. It is a silence of erosion, of pieces missing, of half-heard voices. To piece together meaning here is to work with fragments, to respect the gaps as much as the remains. And yet, in those gaps, the imagination thrives. The flood myths, the star charts, the stepped towers, they suggest that humanity in Mesopotamia was not groping blindly toward order, but was already part of a conversation with the cosmos. Whether they inherited that conversation or began it anew, they gave it form that endures in our own systems of thought. We still measure time in 60 minutes, a relic of their sexagesimal mathematics. We still divide the sky into constellations shaped by their myths. The echoes of their world are in our world, whether we notice or not. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of Mesopotamia. Civilizations may collapse, monuments may crumble, but ideas migrate. They take new forms, cross boundaries, adapt to new tongues. If our story is indeed layered, with forgotten chapters beneath the ones we know, then Mesopotamia is both a chapter and a bridge. It carries something older into something newer, preserving fragments of memory in clay that can still be read today. And in reading them, we hear not only the voices of a single people, but the murmurs of a shared human past, one that stretches further than we can yet see. If Mesopotamia whispers through fragments, the Indus Valley murmurs through patterns. On the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwest India lie the remains of cities so carefully designed that they seem less like relics of the Bronze Age and more like drafts of a blueprint centuries ahead of their time. Streets laid out in perfect grids, drainage systems that still impress modern engineers, standardized weights, and measures that suggest a unity of trade across vast distances. Yet for all this order, the Indus civilization left us almost no words we can understand. Their script, carved into seals and tablets, has resisted every attempt at decipherment. We can see their shapes, their symbols, but we cannot hear their voices. To walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-daro is to feel the paradox of knowledge without story. The bricks stretch in long lines, uniform in size, their arrangement logical and deliberate. Houses open onto courtyards, wells appear on nearly every street, and the great bath at the centre of the city seems to suggest ritual, perhaps cleansing, perhaps something more social. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where kings proclaim their power in monumental inscriptions, the Indus cities are curiously quiet. No grand statues, no named rulers, no epic declarations of conquest. Instead, what survives is a vision of civic order, a society invested in balance rather than display. The seals are the closest we come to their voices. Small squares of steatite carved with animals, unicorn-like figures, bulls, elephants, tigers, and lines of symbols that could be words or codes or prayers. Scholars debate endlessly. Was this script a language or a system of trademarks? Was it phonetic or purely symbolic? Each attempt at decipherment falters, as though the meaning resists translation across millennia. Perhaps that is the greatest mystery of the Indus Valley. A civilization so advanced in practice, yet so elusive in identity. We know how they lived, but not how they named their world. The reach of their culture stretched wide. Artifacts from the Indus have been found as far as Mesopotamia, suggesting contact and exchange. Mesopotamian texts even mention a distant land called Meluha, which many believe referred to the Indus region. Ships carried goods along the Arabian Sea, weaving connections that bound together the Bronze Age world. Yet even in these records, the people of the Indus remain shadowy, referenced but not described, present but silent. One of the most intriguing aspects of their cities is the uniformity. Across hundreds of miles, settlements display the same planning, the same brick sizes, the same systems of water management. This suggests not only shared knowledge, but shared governance, some kind of cohesion that extended far beyond a single city. But if there were rulers, where are their palaces? If there were armies, where are the weapons? Unlike Mesopotamia, there is little evidence of war. Unlike Egypt, there is little evidence of kingship. It is as though the civilization was organized on principles we do not yet understand, principles that defy our categories of power. Then, as with so many ancient societies, comes the silence of decline. Around 1900 BCE, the cities begin to empty. The drainage systems clog, the bricks crumble, the trade routes falter. Some point to climate change, shifts in the monsoon that dried up rivers and made farming difficult. Others suggest disease or gradual economic collapse. Whatever the cause, the once thriving urban culture dissolved, leaving behind villages that carried fragments of its practices, but not its grandeur. By the time Indo-European migrants moved into the region centuries later, the great cities of the Indus were already ruins, their meanings forgotten, and yet traces linger. The emphasis on cleanliness, on ritual bathing, on ordered space, these find echoes in later Indian traditions. The symbols of the seals, though undeciphered, resemble motifs that appear in Hindu iconography centuries later. Continuity may be partial, indirect, but it suggests that the Indus Valley did not vanish completely. Its influence seeped into the cultural soil absorbed and reshaped by later civilizations. Still, we are left with questions. Why did they not carve their histories in stone, as their neighbours did? Why did they invest so much in infrastructure, yet so little in monuments? Why does their script remain beyond our reach, when other scripts of the same era have been cracked? Perhaps the Indus chose to record their lives in ways that do not survive, on perishable materials, in oral traditions now long gone. Or perhaps they simply valued different things, seeing permanence not in words but in the flow of water through well-designed channels, in the rhythm of daily life maintained across generations. To stand in Mohenjo-Daro today is to feel both awe and unease. The streets are there, the outlines of houses, the remnants of wells. You can imagine the movement of people carrying water, the sounds of traders calling out, the quiet ritual of stepping into the great bath. Yet without their words, without their names, it feels like a city dreamed rather than lived. Archaeology can reconstruct function, but identity slips through. We know they were skilled, organised, far-reaching, but who they thought they were, this remains sealed. In that silence lies the possibility of deeper reflection. The Indus Valley reminds us that not all civilizations leave legacies in the forms we expect. Some do not seek immortality through kings or wars or monuments. Some express their greatness in balance, in systems that make daily life flow more smoothly, in structures that serve the collective rather than glorify the few. Perhaps their very mystery is their legacy, challenging us to imagine human achievement beyond the lens of conquest. And so, the Indus Valley sits alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia as one of the world's earliest centres of urban life. But it differs in tone, in priorities, in what it chose to preserve. Its disappearance leaves gaps that scholars fill with theories, but its presence continues in every undeciphered seal, every brick aligned with precision, every street that once carried a people, we can still sense but not yet know. The murmurs of this civilization are quieter than others, but perhaps that quiet is what makes them endure. When we turn from the dry plains of the Indus to the river valleys of China, the scale of mystery shifts, but the theme remains the same. Here, along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, early societies carved out lives that would eventually give rise to dynasties known by name: Shang, Zhou, Han. Yet behind those names, before their chronicles, there is an older shadow, a civilization whose outlines flicker in myth and fragment. To follow it is to listen to voices that speak half in legend, half in soil. Chinese tradition speaks of sage kings, rulers who taught people how to tame rivers, weave silk, cast bronze. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is said to have invented the compass, medicine, and the calendar, a figure who feels more like a cultural archetype than a person of flesh. Yu the Great is credited with controlling floods by channeling rivers rather than blocking them, a philosophy of water management that shaped Chinese thought for millennia. But whether these figures lived as individuals or represent memories of collective achievements is uncertain. Archaeology finds no singular kingly palaces that match their stories, but it does uncover cities and artifacts that suggest organised societies capable of remarkable feats. At Erlitou, in the heart of the Henan province, lies a site many associate with the semi-legendary Xia dynasty, thought to predate the Shang. Excavations reveal palatial structures, workshops for bronze casting, networks of roads, and evidence of social stratification. It feels like the threshold between myth and history, a place where oral memory crystallized into something tangible. Yet scholars debate, is Erlitou truly the Xia, or another culture altogether, later woven into dynastic tradition? The absence of clear texts makes certainty impossible. Bronze itself becomes a kind of language. Chinese bronze vessels, elaborately decorated with taoti motifs, mask-like faces that stare back with haunting symmetry, are among the most distinctive artifacts of the ancient world. These were not everyday objects, but ritual items cast with skill that demanded complex knowledge of alloys, moulds, and controlled heating. Each vessel may have served as a communication with ancestors, a way to pour wine or offerings into the unseen realm. In their designs, some see continuity with earlier Neolithic symbols, as though ideas about spirits and protection had travelled from painted pottery into the permanence of metal. The Shang dynasty, which followed, left oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox scapulae inscribed with the earliest known Chinese writing. Cracks formed by fire were read as divine messages, and the questions etched upon them tell us of concerns both mundane and cosmic: harvests, warfare, childbirth, the weather. These bones link us to a society deeply invested in connecting the human with the divine. But even here, there are hints that writing, casting, and ritual were not sudden inventions but inheritances, drawn from traditions we still do not fully see. The geography of China adds to the complexity. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, with single rivers defining their course, China held multiple centres of development. Along the Yangtze, sites like Liangzhu flourished long before the Shang, with jade artefacts that rival anything from later dynasties in sophistication. Jade Kong and Bai, cylindrical and disc-shaped objects, appear repeatedly, their purpose uncertain but their symbolism powerful. To touch them is to feel an artistry that valued hardness, transformed into beauty, a material that resisted time as if chosen deliberately for endurance. Liangzhu fell around 2000 BCE, its demise linked to flooding or shifts in river courses. Yet its legacy may echo in the ritual traditions of later Chinese culture, in the centrality of jade as a symbol of purity and moral strength. Here again, continuity appears not in straightforward lineage, but in echoes, as though memory survived through objects when names did not. Chinese myth and archaeology dance in this way, each suggesting the other, but never aligning perfectly. Dragons appear in Neolithic carvings, serpentine figures that wind across jade and pottery. Later, dragons become symbols of imperial authority, protectors of reign and prosperity. Did the dragon myth begin as observation of river patterns, of twisting currents that both nurtured and destroyed, or did it emerge from the imagination of people who saw power in serpentine movement and gave it sacred weight? What makes China's ancient past particularly intriguing is the dual nature of its memory. Unlike the Indus Valley, where silence dominates, or Mesopotamia, where text floods in abundance, China offers both mythic continuity and archaeological hints. The stories of sage kings are preserved in chronicles compiled centuries after their supposed reigns, but the soil gives us cities, artifacts, and vessels that show human ingenuity pressing forward long before written records. The tension between what is remembered and what is unearthed creates a landscape where history feels perpetually just beyond reach. And as with other early civilizations, decline plays its part. Floods, droughts, invasions all shape the rhythms of rise and fall. Yet in China, there is a remarkable persistence, a reweaving of culture even after collapse. Dynasties fall, but language and ritual persist, absorbing and reshaping what came before. Perhaps this resilience is why myth and archaeology remain so tightly interwoven. The past was never entirely erased, only reinterpreted. to stand at Erlitu, to hold a jade Kong from Liangju, to see the marks on an oracle bone. These are ways of glimpsing a society both alien and familiar. Alien in its symbols, its rituals, its ways of imagining power and spirit. Familiar in its concerns, its need to understand floods, crops, the unknown future. The people who cast bronze or inscribed bones were not so different from us, seeking order in uncertainty, permanence in fragile lives. In the end, the Chinese story reminds us that civilization is not a line but a web. Myths feed into artifacts. Artifacts inspire myths, and between them lies the human effort to create meaning in a vast landscape. To trace these beginnings is to acknowledge both the brilliance and the ambiguity of our ancestors. To see that what endures is not just cities or kings, but the search itself, the reaching across time to ask who we are and where we come from. Southward from the Chinese plains, the mountains and rivers fold into a different rhythm, carrying us into Southeast Asia. Here, where monsoon rains carve valleys and jungles spread with relentless growth, the archaeological record is more elusive. Stone crumbles in the humid air, wood dissolves, and yet in scattered places the land yields fragments of stories that stretch far back into time. These are not the neat sequences of dynasties inscribed in texts, but broken shards and sudden revelations, suggesting that complexity thrived here earlier than we often admit. At Ban Chiang, in northeast Thailand, pottery painted with spirals and crosshatch designs lies in layers that archaeologists date to over 3,000 years ago. Some argue even earlier. Alongside the pottery, bronze tools appear, evidence that metallurgy had reached these communities at a time when much of the region is assumed to have been simple village life. If the dating is correct, Ban Chiang challenges long-held timelines, suggesting that Southeast Asia participated in technological networks earlier than textbooks once allowed. Bronze here was not only utility, it was crafted into ornaments, into objects that seemed to have held social meaning. In the swirls of red paint on clay vessels, one can almost sense an aesthetic that wanted to endure, a way of placing identity into earth and fire. Farther west, in Myanmar, the site of Harlin reveals traces of planned settlements, moats and rice paddies, organised with precision. Here, agriculture becomes not merely subsistence but landscape engineering, a communal act that required coordination across generations. Rice, the grain that would come to define much of Asia's diet, was cultivated in systems that demanded careful control of water, a technology as sophisticated in its own way as the canals of Mesopotamia or the Nile's irrigation. These communities, though smaller and less monumental than Egypt or China, demonstrate that the foundations of civilization, agriculture, metallurgy, artistry, were not confined to river valleys alone, but spread and adapted into environments where jungle and flood defined existence. Myths across the region echo with memories of water. Floods are recurring themes in tales from Vietnam, Thailand, and the islands further south. The Cham people of central Vietnam tell of spirits who controlled rivers, demanding respect and offerings lest waters rise in anger. In some stories, dragons again appear, linking these cultures in symbolic language, not unlike the serpentine motifs of China. Dragons here are not creatures of fire, but of water, guardians of rain, tied directly to the cycles of survival. The repetition of such imagery across vast distances invites the question, were these independent creations of human imagination or whispers carried by traders, migrants, sailors across coasts and mountains? On the Mekong, in what is now Cambodia and Laos, smaller early settlements hint at traditions that would eventually culminate in Angkor centuries later. But even before Angkor's stone towers, the land nurtured cultures adept at harnessing water, building reservoirs, and mapping spiritual worlds onto landscapes. The idea that Southeast Asia was peripheral dissolves when we realize that its heart was pulsing with its own patterns, shaped by rain and river rather than desert or steppe. Moving into the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines, seafaring enters the frame. Long before European navigators crossed oceans, the Austronesian expansion had already carried people thousands of miles across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Beginning perhaps 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, these voyagers left Taiwan in canoes and spread through the Philippines, Indonesia, Polynesia, and beyond to Madagascar, off the coast of Africa. Their navigation relied not on compasses or maps, but on memory, star paths, ocean swells, the flight of birds, the colour of the horizon at dawn. Such knowledge, passed through generations, amounts to one of humanity's great achievements, a living science of the seas. Archaeology supports this journey with linguistic evidence. Austronesian languages are spoken across a vast arc, from Hawaiian to Malagasy, a distribution that testifies to shared origins. Alongside language, pottery styles and genetic studies reinforce the picture of an interconnected maritime world. The voyagers carried not only themselves but crops, bananas, taro, yams, transplanting entire ecological systems as they settled new islands. Civilization here is not built in stone but in movement, in the ability to sustain life across shifting horizons. The Lapita culture, identified through its intricately decorated pottery, marks this Austronesian spread into the Pacific. Lapita designs of geometric patterns pressed into clay suggest a shared identity, a kind of portable tradition carried on long voyages. These fragments, found in places as far apart as New Caledonia and Samoa, are pieces of a maritime web stretching thousands of kilometres. Imagine the courage required to set sail into horizons where no land was visible, trusting in stars and inherited memory. In such acts lies a form of civilization no less profound than the raising of pyramids or ziggurats. The environment here dictated resilience. Volcanoes, earthquakes, typhoons. These forces of nature shaped cultures that learned to bend and adapt. Myths are full of them. Gods of fire who live in mountains, ocean deities who churn storms, ancestors who transformed into animals or stars. Each story is a way of explaining a world in constant flux, a dialogue with forces too immense to control, but too intimate to ignore. In the Philippines, megalithic structures such as those on Batanes Islands hint at ritual landscapes, while oral traditions preserve tales of origins tied to mountains and seas. On Sulawesi, ancient cave paintings of hand stencils and animals, dated to over 40,000 years ago, remind us that this region's story is not just about the last few millennia, but stretches deep into the Ice Age. The fact that these are among the oldest known artworks in the world complicates the picture. Southeast Asia was not late to join the human story, it was there from the beginning. Taken together, the record of Southeast Asia and the Pacific unsettles older hierarchies of history. For too long, the spotlight lingered on Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, India, while these lands were cast as peripheral, waiting for influence. Yet the truth is more expansive. These regions nurtured their own trajectories, from rice fields to bronze workshops, from painted caves to seafaring networks that reached farther than most ancient empires could dream. Their contributions were not marginal. They were part of the great human experiment in shaping environments, stories, and identities. To stand on a beach in Polynesia, watching the horizons stretch unbroken, is to feel the enormity of what these early navigators achieved. To hold a shard of lapita pottery is to touch the memory of a voyage that spanned oceans. To trace the spirals on a Banqiang vessel is to glimpse a mind reaching for beauty as well as function. These are not footnotes, but chapters of the same story. The human urge to create, to connect, to survive, to dream. Across the Himalayas, the high plateau of Central Asia stretches like a vast roof of the world. Here, where winds scrape barren steppes and mountain peaks guard hidden valleys, the story of humanity unfolds differently. It is not a tale of monumental stone cities or vast irrigation canals, but of mobility, of survival through movement, of people who learn to read grass, stars, and seasons as carefully as scribes elsewhere read tablets. Nomads are often described in contrast to civilization, as if their lives existed only at the edges of empires. Yet to look closely is to realize that mobility itself is a form of order, a system as sophisticated as any temple or palace. The steppes have long been corridors of connection, herding communities domesticated horses here, transforming human history forever. The earliest evidence of horseback riding comes from Kazakhstan's Botai culture over 5,000 years ago. These people not only kept horses but may have milked them, shaping a bond between animal and human that carried profound consequences. With horses, distance shrank, and landscapes that seemed impassable became traversable. A rider could scout, trade, raid, or migrate at speeds unimaginable to a farmer bound to a field. The horse was not merely a tool, it was an extension of identity, woven into myth and ritual. Archaeological sites in the Altai Mountains preserve burials filled with horse trappings, bridles, and remains of sacrificed animals. These are not the traces of barbarism, but of a worldview where humans and animals formed a shared destiny. The Scythians, described by Greek historians, left kurgans, mound burials, filled with gold ornaments shaped into deer, eagles, and mythical beasts. The artistry is striking. Curves and interlocked figures suggest a fluidity that mirrored the steppe itself, where nothing stays still and everything flows. To hold one of these golden plaques is to sense both elegance and ferocity, a culture that valued beauty even in the tools of war. The Greeks often portrayed nomads as wild, uncivilized, drinking milk and blood, yet they also marvelled at their skill in battle, their mastery of bow and horse. The contrast tells us as much about Greek anxieties as it does about the steppe. To sedentary societies, mobility can feel like chaos, a threat that cannot be walled out. But from the inside, mobility is coherence. Herds moved according to pasture, clans shifted with the seasons, alliances and rivalries stretched across horizons. This was civilization not of stone, but of time and space, marked in memory and path rather than brick and mortar. Central Asia was never isolated. Goods and ideas moved along these grasslands long before the Silk Road became a named network. Jade from the Tarim Basin reached China's earliest dynasties. Horses from the Fergana Valley became treasures in Han palaces. In return, silk and bronze travelled westward, carried not by merchants trudging deserts alone, but often by nomadic groups who acted as intermediaries. To see the steppe as empty is to miss its role as connective tissue, binding worlds together across thousands of miles. The myths of this region often reflect both the harshness and the expansiveness of the land. Sky gods dominate, dwelling above the endless horizon. Tengri, the eternal blue sky of Turkic and Mongolic traditions, embodies a power that is both distant and immediate, overarching and intimate. Beneath Tengri, ancestors are honoured in steles and carved figures, reminders that even in mobility there is continuity, that identity persists not in walls but in lineage and ritual. Shamanic traditions, still alive in fragments today, trace journeys between worlds, a mirror perhaps of the physical journeys across steppe and desert. One of the most haunting discoveries comes from the Tarim Basin in present-day Xinjiang, where desiccated mummies lie preserved in desert sands. Their features, textiles, and burial goods suggest a blend of cultures, Indo-European, Central Asian, Chinese, hinting at early mixtures long before empires formally expanded. These individuals, with their felt hats and woolen cloaks, embody the reality that Central Asia was a crossroads, not a void. Genetic studies confirm what archaeology suggests. Populations here were diverse, interacting across immense distances, part of a story of human mobility, written not in chronicles, but in bone and thread. Empires rose and fell at the edges of this space, but the nomads endured, often shaping the destinies of those empires. The Xiongnu pressed against China's Han dynasty, forcing the construction of walls. Centuries later, the Mongols under Genghis Khan forged the largest contiguous empire in history, born not from cities but from steppe strategies, mobility, discipline, communication across vast distances. The seeds of that empire, however, lie in these earlier millennia, in the gradual refinement of horsemanship, pastoralism, and kinship structures that allowed such sudden expansions when conditions aligned. From the perspective of archaeology, Central Asia resists neat narratives. Sites are scattered, material culture often sparse compared to Egypt or Mesopotamia. Yet absence does not mean insignificance. The very difficulty of reconstructing this past reflects its nature. Lives lived in movement leave lighter traces, but those traces can ripple across the world. A single innovation, riding the horse, reshaped continents. A single pathway across a mountain pass could redirect trade routes for centuries. Civilization here is measured not in temples, but in horizons. To walk the steppe today, hearing the wind flatten the grass, is to sense both vastness and intimacy. Each hill could hide a burial mound. Each valley could have once echoed with the sound of herds. The land remembers, even if it does not show its memories openly. And perhaps that is the lesson of Central Asia, that not all civilization needs to be visible in stone. Some of it endures in ways less obvious but equally enduring, in the rhythms of migration, in the bonds between human and animal, in the capacity to adapt to extremes. So the story of humanity widens again, from pyramids to rice terraces, from temples to sailing canoes, and now to the open steppe. The forms of civilization multiply. What we call history is not a straight line, but a web, with strands stretching in directions we are still learning to see. And somewhere in that web, the horse gallops, carrying with it the echo of hoofbeats across grasslands, an echo that still shapes us. Far to the west, beyond the grasslands and deserts, the Mediterranean opens like a vast basin where cultures have long collided and mingled. To imagine this sea in antiquity is to picture not the isolated fragments of Greece, Egypt, or Phoenicia, but a pulsing web of harbours, ships, and shorelines where everything touched everything else. It was less a boundary than a medium of connection, a liquid mirror reflecting both cooperation and conflict. If Central Asia was the great steppe highway of movement. The Mediterranean was its waterborne counterpart, carrying not only goods, but also myths, scripts, and architectural ideas from shore to shore. Archaeologists speak often of the Bronze Age, that long era when copper alloyed with tin to produce weapons, and tools harder than stone, shaping the rise of kingdoms and palaces. But bronze was not simply a technological milestone, it was a symbol of dependence. Tin was rare, scattered across distant lands, sometimes as far away as the British Isles or Central Asia. To bring it together with copper required networks, and those networks were maritime as much as terrestrial. The ships that cut across the Aegean and Levant carried not only amphorae of oil or jars of wine, but also the lifeblood of entire civilizations. The island of Crete, home of the Minoans, once thrived on this watery web. Its palaces at Knossos and Phaistos, with their labyrinthine corridors and vibrant frescoes, reflect a culture deeply attuned to the sea. Dolphins, octopuses, and swirling waves painted across walls suggest that identity itself was tied to maritime rhythms. Some scholars see in the myth of King Minos and his labyrinth a metaphor for this complexity, a culture whose power rested on navigating both physical and symbolic mazes, balancing trade, ritual, and authority. Yet by around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean system fractured. The so-called Bronze Age collapse brought down palaces from Mycenae to Ugarit, leaving behind texts filled with desperation, letters begging for grain, warnings of invaders, silence where once there was abundance. Into this silence, new actors emerged. The Phoenicians, seafaring traders of the Levant, expanded outward, founding colonies from Cyprus to Carthage. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense, but merchants, carrying cedar wood, glass and purple dye, prized across the world. Their greatest legacy, however, may have been script. The Phoenician alphabet, pared down and efficient, spread westward, eventually shaping Greek, Latin, and the writing systems that form the bones of much of today's literacy. Thus, the Mediterranean was not only an economic network, but also a cultural transmitter, carrying the DNA of communication itself across centuries. Egypt, too, was part of this maritime sphere. Though rooted in the Nile, pharaohs looked outward, importing cedar for ships, lapis from Afghanistan, and silver from Anatolia. The walls of Medinet Habu, temple of Ramses III, depict sea battles against mysterious sea peoples, invaders whose origins remain debated. Were they displaced migrants, raiders seeking new lands, or remnants of collapsing kingdoms? Whatever their identity, their arrival reshaped the balance of the Eastern Mediterranean, toppling states and forcing adaptation. Once again, the sea was not just a route of exchange but of upheaval. Yet amid turmoil, resilience persisted. Small communities rebuilt, repurposed, and reimagined the world. In the centuries after the collapse, new forms of social organisation emerged. City-states in Greece, drawing on both Mycenaean memory and Phoenician influence, began experimenting with political systems that would later inspire ideas of citizenship. On other shores, Israelites developed distinct identities, crafting narratives that merged history, faith, and geography into enduring texts. The Mediterranean was less a theatre of endings than of transformations, where collapse gave way to reinvention. What makes the Mediterranean so fascinating is its capacity to hold opposites. It could be a cradle of cooperation, where shared waters nurtured alliances and hybrid cultures. It could also be a crucible of conflict, where naval battles and piracy disrupted lives. For archaeologists, each amphora fragment each harbour ruin is a clue not only to what was traded, but also to how human societies navigated the tension between unity and fragmentation. Consider the Uluburun shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey. Dated to the late Bronze Age, its cargo was a miniature world: copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, glass ivory, gold jewellery, scarabs from Egypt, and amber from the Baltic. To stand before these objects today is to realise that globalisation is not new. It is ancient, fragile, and deeply human. This single ship held materials from at least 7 distinct regions, evidence that even 3 millennia ago the world was interconnected in ways both astonishing and precarious. Myths echo this maritime reality. Stories of Odysseus wandering from island to island, or of Jason and the Argonauts seeking the Golden Fleece, may be less about literal journeys and more about the archetypal experience of Mediterranean travel. Unpredictable, dangerous, yet full of possibility. The sea itself becomes a character in these tales, treacherous, generous, a force to be negotiated rather than conquered. To sail was to gamble, but also to belong to a larger horizon. Even today, walking along ruined harbours, Tyre's submerged breakwaters, Delos' silent quays, you can sense the layered voices of this past. Fishermen, merchants, priests, soldiers, mothers, all tied to the rhythm of waves. Each community left traces. A temple here, a shard of pottery there, graffiti carved into stone by sailors waiting for favourable winds. Civilization here was not static but tidal, rising and falling with currents, adjusting with storms, forever shaped by water. So the Mediterranean becomes a reminder. Civilization does not always anchor itself in soil. Sometimes it floats, drifts and moors only temporarily before moving on. Its strength lies in adaptation, in openness, in the courage to set sail into uncertainty. And in that courage we see a reflection of ourselves, the willingness to risk, to connect, to build across divides. Beyond the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, another vast world stretched across the Atlantic. For centuries, historians believed these two spheres remained separate until the voyages of Columbus in the late 15th century. Yet whispers of earlier crossings persist, hovering in the margins of history. The Atlantic is a harsher stage than the Mediterranean, unpredictable in its storms and immense in its breadth. But the idea that no one ever crossed it until recently is harder to accept when we examine the fragments of evidence scattered across cultures. Legends on both sides hint at contact. Norse sagas tell of voyages westward from Greenland, reaching a place they called Vinland, rich with grapes and forests. Archaeological remains at Lens-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland confirm that Norse explorers reached North America around the year 1000 CE. Though their settlements were small and temporary, their presence reveals that transoceanic crossings were not impossible. Centuries earlier, Carthaginian and Phoenician sailors were said to have ventured into the Atlantic, perhaps as far as the Canary Islands or beyond. Herodotus recounts tales of Carthaginian merchants who sailed down the coast of Africa, trading silently with distant peoples by leaving goods on the shore. Were such expeditions limited to coastal voyages, or did some push farther into open waters? We cannot say with certainty, but the stories endure. In the Americas, myths of bearded visitors or strangers arriving by sea circulate through traditions. The Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, each preserved stories of unexpected arrivals from the horizon. Some were framed as gods, others as wanderers, but all carried the weight of disruption It is tempting to link these myths to old world travellers, though caution is necessary. Myth is not evidence in the strict sense, but it is an archive of cultural memory, a way communities preserve experiences that do not fit neatly into daily life. When myths appear in parallel across continents, they invite at least the question of shared encounters. Object 2 feed speculation. Roman coins have been found in the Americas, though their context is uncertain. Were they dropped by later collectors or carried by earlier travellers? Similarly, plants like maize and sweet potatoes appear in unexpected places. Some studies suggest pre-Columbian contact between South America and Polynesia, as evidenced by the spread of the sweet potato across the Pacific long before European expansion. If Polynesian sailors, masters of ocean navigation using stars, currents and bird flight, could traverse thousands of miles, is it inconceivable that they reached the Americas? The Pacific, after all, is no less daunting than the Atlantic. Yet Polynesians populated islands scattered like grains of sand across it. The possibility of earlier Atlantic crossings does not diminish the significance of 1492, but it reframes it. Columbus did not discover an unknown world. He initiated sustained contact, backed by empire and driven by expansion. But before empire, there may have been glimpses, ships arriving, leaving, sometimes leaving no trace beyond a tail, a shard, a single genetic marker. For archaeology, absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Seas erase more than they preserve. A wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic, if discovered, could rewrite entire narratives. What drives these speculations is not only curiosity about who arrived first, but also recognition that oceans are less barriers than bridges. For ancient people, water was not an obstacle to be feared, but a space of movement. Canoes, rafts, and ships were extensions of imagination, tools that turned horizon into opportunity. To sail into unknown waters required faith in gods, in stars, in craft, but it also required a worldview that saw the world as connected rather than closed. In this sense, myths of Atlantis capture more than fantasy. Plato's tale of a great island, swallowed by the sea, has fascinated generations, often dismissed as allegory or invention. Yet beneath its layers lies a deeper truth. The sea can both give and take, creating civilizations and erasing them. Whether or not Atlantis existed as described, its story resonates with human memory of floods, submergence, and sudden loss. From Doggerland in the North Sea to submerged ruins off India's coast, archaeology has confirmed that rising waters have indeed erased human settlements. Perhaps Atlantis is less a place than a recurring theme, the fragility of coastal civilizations before the power of oceans. If we imagine the Atlantic in ancient times, we must imagine not silence, but possibility. Canoes leaving African shores, rafts drifting with currents, ships blown off course. These are not certainties, but plausibilities. Currents like the Canary and Gulf Stream could have carried vessels across even unintentionally. Some might never have returned, but a few may have arrived, bearing stories too strange to be believed, only to become myths. Standing on a modern shoreline, watching the horizon, it is difficult to conceive the courage required to sail without maps, without knowledge of what lay beyond. Yet people did, again and again. Some journeys ended in tragedy, others in discovery, but together they form the hidden history of oceans. They remind us that the world has always been more connected than neat timelines suggest. So, when we think of the Atlantic before Columbus, we need not imagine an untouched void. Instead, we might picture a stage where small fleeting acts played out, voyages, encounters, exchanges that did not lead to permanent bridges, but left echoes. These echoes remain in legends, in genetic traces, in stray artifacts. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but a manuscript with missing pages, some of which may still be waiting beneath waves. If oceans can connect across vast distances, then so can ideas carried not only by sails but by memory, by symbols carved or painted, by rituals that cross borders more easily than ships. Archaeologists and anthropologists often stumble upon motifs that appear in distant places, separated by oceans or mountains, yet uncannily similar. Spiral patterns, serpent figures, solar discs, these images emerge again and again, not as simple coincidences but as echoes of a shared human imagination. The question is not whether cultures copied one another directly, but whether they were tapping into something universal, or whether subtle exchanges occurred long before we assume. Consider the serpent winding its way through mythologies from Mesoamerica to Mesopotamia. In the temples of the Maya, Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, descends the pyramid steps when the solstice sun strikes in just the right way. In Sumer, Ningishida, the serpent deity, guarded the doorway to the underworld. In Greece, the serpent coils at the staff of Asclepius, symbol of healing that persists even today. Across continents, the serpent embodies transformation, wisdom, danger, and renewal. Did one culture cede the idea to another? Or does the serpent simply reflect an archetype that emerges whenever humans observe the shedding of skin and imagine rebirth? The sun, too, receives universal reverence, from Stonehenge in Britain to the pyramids of Egypt, from the geoglyphs in Peru to the temples of Angkor. Structures align with the rising or setting sun at solstices and equinoxes. This alignment suggests not only practical astronomy, but also a shared awe, the recognition that the sun governs cycles of life. Farmers across the world knew that seeds sprout and crops ripen by its power. To honour it with architecture was to weave survival into stone. Yet the precision of these alignments still provokes wonder. How could cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time each master the same cosmic geometry? Perhaps necessity guided them, but perhaps stories of methods, techniques, or simply inspiration travelled farther than we realise. Even more enigmatic are the pyramids. Step pyramids rise in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Mesoamerica, in Southeast Asia. Though separated, they share a striking form. Vast bases narrowing toward the sky, as if mountains were shaped by human hands to reach upward. The ziggurats of Ur and the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Teotihuacan, and the pyramids of the Maya all echo the same impulse. Some argue this is evidence of cultural diffusion, a memory of an ancient shared source. Others suggest it is convergent evolution of architecture. The pyramid is simply the most stable way to build high with primitive materials. But perhaps both are true, practicality and inspiration merging into forms that connect cultures invisibly. Symbols carved on stones travel even when people do not. The swastika, now burdened with a tragic 20th century legacy, appears in prehistoric carvings across Europe, in Hindu and Buddhist traditions in Asia, among Native American tribes in North America. Long before its appropriation, it symbolized the revolving sun, cycles of fortune, movement of stars. How could one symbol span continents? Was it carried by migrating peoples, or is it another echo of humanity's shared gaze upon the heavens? Language itself bears these mysteries. Words and sounds drift across boundaries, reshaped but recognizable. Some linguists trace ancient connections between languages separated by oceans, suggesting that human speech holds within it the faint fingerprints of migrations long forgotten. A single word for mother or water may resonate across tongues, hinting at kinship beyond recorded history. And then there are maps, fragments of parchment or stories retold by sailors that describe coastlines unknown to their time. The Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral, depicts parts of South America with surprising accuracy. Alongside a coastline, many interpret as Antarctica, centuries before its official discovery. How did such knowledge survive? Some claim it is evidence of older maps, inherited from civilizations that charted the globe earlier than we imagine. Perhaps Phoenicians or lost mariners whose names are gone left these legacies embedded in cartographic tradition. Skeptics argue that coincidences, misinterpretations, or distortions explain the anomalies. Yet even skeptics acknowledge the fascination, the sense that knowledge sometimes leaps across time in ways that seem almost impossible. When we look at these parallels, serpents, suns, pyramids, symbols, we must resist the urge to reduce them to a single origin. The world is too complex for that. Yet we must also resist dismissing them as mere coincidence. The truth may lie in the middle, a tapestry woven from threads of independent genius, threads of forgotten contact, and threads of human universals. The act of comparison itself tells us something profound, that human beings, wherever they lived, reached for meaning in similar ways, and sometimes those ways crossed paths. What is striking is not just the similarity of symbols, but their persistence. Thousands of years may pass, yet a spiral etched on a Neolithic stone resonates with spirals in pottery across the ocean. The image becomes a bridge, not of stone or timber, but of recognition. It tells us that imagination is as migratory as any sailor. So as we sift through ruins and inscriptions, we are not merely cataloguing objects, we are listening for echoes of thoughts that may have travelled farther than bodies, echoes of a humanity that has always been more connected than borders allow. Symbols remind us that while civilizations rise and fall, the language of imagination endures, whispering across oceans of time. And perhaps this endurance is the real link between cultures, not evidence of conspiracy or hidden empires, but evidence that humans everywhere share the same questions, the same awe before the cosmos, the same urge to carve permanence into stone. The mystery is not only how ideas travelled, but how they survive, resurfacing centuries later, in places we never expected. Every ruin invites silence, but there are ruins where silence feels heavier, where the air itself seems to carry the weight of memory. Along the coasts of the Mediterranean, half-buried cities remind us that seas can be both lifelines and graveyards. Entire harbours lie drowned beneath the waves, their colonnades visible only to divers or through the distorted lens of sonar. Pavement stones, once beneath the feet of merchants, now rest under layers of sand and seaweed. These submerged ruins suggest that coastlines were not always where they are now. Earthquakes, rising seas, or shifts in land may have swallowed them, but they also remind us of how fragile civilizations are when their lives are tied to the edge of water. Take Heracleion, once a bustling port at the mouth of the Nile. For centuries it was lost, mentioned only in ancient texts, dismissed by many as legend. Then in the early 2000s, archaeologists rediscovered it beneath the waves. Colossal statues of pharaohs, fragments of ships, everyday tools, all resting in a city no longer on land. It is not just the romance of rediscovery that captures us, but the implications. If entire cities can vanish, how much else has been lost? Not to disaster, but to time, waiting in places we do not think to look. The Mediterranean is not alone. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers report temples submerged under the Arabian Sea. In Japan, near Yonaguni, vast stone formations rise beneath the surface, steps and terraces that some interpret as the remnants of an ancient complex, though others argue they are natural formations. The debate remains unsettled, but even the argument reveals something. We are drawn to the possibility that beneath the seas, pieces of forgotten history linger. The ocean is a keeper of secrets, sometimes cruel in its concealment. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, entire landscapes disappeared. Plains where people may have hunted, villages where fires once burned, all drowned beneath advancing waves. Doggerland, a stretch of land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, is now gone. But archaeologists recover bones, tools, and even traces of forests from the seabed. The notion that our maps are incomplete, that whole chapters of human life are underwater, unsettles the way we think about history. In myths and traditions, we hear faint reflections of these losses. Stories of floods echo across cultures. The Mesopotamian tale of Utnapishtim, the biblical Noah, the Hindu Manu, the Mesoamerican floods before the rise of the fifth sun. Each describes waters rising, humanity nearly extinguished, then renewal. Were these only symbolic parables, or do they contain memories of real catastrophes passed through generations? Perhaps myths preserve in metaphor what geology records in stone, the trauma of seeing worlds submerged. What is remarkable is how many of these drowned places were centres of exchange. Ports and harbours, where goods and ideas met, seem especially vulnerable to vanishing. It is as though the very openness that made them thrive also placed them on fragile ground. When we think of trade in ancient times, we imagine caravans or ships laden with spices, metals, or grain. Yet what also moved were stories, techniques, fragments of cosmology. The submersion of a harbour city is not only the loss of stone and timber, but the silencing of a hub where worlds once touched. Modern technology allows us to peer further into these forgotten worlds. Sonar scans reveal rectilinear patterns on the seafloor. Underwater robots capture images of streets that once bustled with life. Yet the more we find, the more we sense the enormity of what remains hidden. If just a few decades of exploration can uncover Heraclean or Dwarka, what might centuries of careful searching reveal? And what of regions still untouched, coasts too deep or dangerous for study? There is a haunting symmetry in the thought. Our ancestors built upon the shore, confident in the permanence of their stones. Today, cities like New York, Tokyo, or Shanghai rise in the same faith, at the mercy of tides and tectonics. The ruins beneath the sea remind us that no matter how mighty, no city is beyond the reach of water. But beyond warnings, there is also inspiration. The recovery of submerged artifacts teaches us humility about the scope of history. What we know is only a fraction, and that fraction rests on dry land. The drowned world beneath the seas holds another archive, waiting. This awareness changes how we read myths, how we weigh anomalies, how we imagine the deep past. It whispers that our timeline is not fixed, that there are still discoveries capable of reshaping it. Perhaps this is why the legend of Atlantis, told by Plato, has such enduring grip. He described a mighty island empire that sank in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars debate whether it was allegory, political parable, or memory of a real catastrophe. Many scoff at attempts to locate it, yet the persistence of the idea that a great civilization could vanish beneath the sea reflects truths revealed again and again in archaeology. Atlantis may not exist as described, but lost worlds do. They are there, lying in silence, only now returning to view. As we imagine these submerged cities, we confront both wonder and humility. We recognize that history is not fixed but fluid, shaped as much by what has vanished as by what remains. The sea teaches us that the past is layered, with chapters erased, overwritten, and then rediscovered. The ruins below the waves are not only reminders of human vulnerability, but also beacons of continuity, showing us that civilizations rise, fall, and sometimes re-emerge in the stories we tell. To walk among columns beneath the water is to stand in two worlds at once, the present of divers and technology, and the past of merchants, priests, and sailors. It is to see history suspended, like a memory too heavy to dissolve. And it leaves us with the question, if this much lies hidden so close to our familiar shores, what of the deeper oceans, the trenches and plains no human has yet seen? How many worlds might still be waiting, preserved in silence, for the day curiosity and courage bring them back to light? There are landscapes where absence feels louder than presence. Vast deserts stretch for miles, empty horizons of sand and stone. Yet within these silences, there are whispers of buried cities, traces of forgotten lives hidden beneath dunes. The desert does not erase quickly. It preserves, concealing entire settlements until wind or accident reveals them again. For travellers crossing such places, every ripple of sand might cover an archway. Every rocky rise might hide a stair. To enter these regions is to walk upon a kind of archive, written not in ink, but in shifting grains. In the Sahara, once thought of only as endless wasteland, satellites have revealed outlines of structures, walls, and forgotten riverbeds. Long ago, this desert was not desert at all. Fossilized fish, petroglyphs of boats, and carvings of hippos tell us that where there is now only sand, there were once lakes and rivers. What might have lived there? Not only herds of animals, but people, communities, entire cultures, whose ruins are now hidden beneath dunes. When the climate shifted, the desert claimed them, leaving behind fragments too faint for traditional archaeology, but visible from space. Consider the story of Zazura, a lost oasis spoken of in medieval texts. It was described as a white city hidden deep in the Sahara, filled with treasures and guarded by mysterious keepers. For centuries it was treated as a myth, a tale told by traders. Yet explorers in the 20th century began finding signs of settlements in regions once dismissed as barren. Were these echoes of Zazura, or does the legend merely condense the memory of multiple lost communities blurred into a single mythical place? The desert is deceptive in another way. While the sea swallows silently, the desert covers noisily, with storms and winds that shift entire landscapes in a single night. Villages can be buried within hours, their outlines smoothed into dunes that no outsider would suspect hold walls or roofs beneath. To uncover such places requires persistence and sometimes chance. In Egypt, sand has concealed entire temples, only to reveal them centuries later, their inscriptions intact, as though the desert had kept watch. Beyond the Sahara, other arid lands guard similar mysteries. In Central Asia, beneath the sands of the Taklamakan, archaeologists have unearthed remarkably preserved mummies. Their faces, clothing, even hair remain, protected by the dryness. These are not the stereotypical features one might expect in the heart of Asia, but figures with varied appearances, suggesting a crossroads of cultures long before the Silk Road formalized exchange. The desert does not only erase, it stores in silence until discovery alters our sense of who met whom and when. Deserts also remind us of the fragility of memory. Oral traditions in many cultures speak of once green lands now barren. In the Sahel, in Arabia, in the American Southwest, there are stories of waters that retreated, of gods who turned fertile plains to dust as punishment, of migrations forced by thirst. When we read these as myths alone, we miss their second life as memory. They may be recollections of climate change, of communities forced to move, of once thriving cities lost when rains failed. Technology reshapes how we listen to these silences. Ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, and satellite imagery allow us to see beneath sand. Straight lines emerge where dunes seem random, showing walls, streets, or canals. What appears natural from the ground becomes clearly human from above. In recent decades, thousands of sites have been mapped in this way, many still unexcavated. We are beginning to realize that deserts are not empty spaces between civilizations, but repositories of civilizations themselves, interrupted and buried. There is also the philosophical weight of deserts. In the stillness of dunes, we confront the scale of time. Sand is made of broken stone, grain shaped by erosion over millennia. To walk through it is to feel the collapse of mountains into dust. When that dust conceals entire cities, the desert becomes a metaphor as much as a landscape, a reminder that permanence is an illusion, that every empire, no matter how mighty, can dissolve into particles carried by the wind. And yet, against this backdrop of impermanence, there is resilience. Nomadic peoples learn to live with the desert, not against it. They carried memory and stories in roots passed down, in songs that mapped water sources. These voices connect us to the buried cities too. Even if stones are gone, the memory of their presence lingers in oral maps. Perhaps Zazura is not only a place but also a symbol of continuity, the idea that even when cities vanish, people endure, carrying fragments of them forward. To stand in the desert at night is to sense this duality. The silence of the dunes feels absolute, yet underfoot may be streets where markets once rang with voices. The stars above seem eternal, yet the ground beneath is shifting, hiding and revealing in cycles we only glimpse. Archaeologists dig for fragments, but the desert keeps its secrets stubbornly, offering only hints. The immensity of what is still buried humbles us. In the end, deserts ask us to imagine. They challenge us to see beyond the surface, to understand that emptiness is never truly empty. They remind us that our picture of history is incomplete, drawn from what happens to survive. Every lost city beneath the sand is a caution that there are more chapters than we know, more beginnings and endings than we acknowledge. The desert does not shout this truth, it whispers it in winds that carry grains across time. Perhaps one day, future explorers will uncover more cities, more evidence of forgotten cultures in these oceans of sand. Or perhaps the desert will continue to guard them, preserving them in silence until curiosity and chance coincide. Either way, the dunes are not void. They are volumes, heavy with unwritten chapters, waiting for the careful reader who understands that even absence has a story to tell. Beneath the waves, silence is different than silence in the desert. Here it is dense and alive, filled with the hum of currents and the distant call of whales. The sea has always been a keeper of secrets, and among those secrets are the ruins of human effort, walls, roads, temples swallowed by salt water. To explore them is to step into an archive that shifts and breathes, a library where pages float and tides rearrange the shelves. Unlike desert sands which preserve, the sea corrodes, but it also protects, sealing away entire landscapes until divers and sonar rediscover them centuries later. Off the coast of Japan lies Yonaguni, a submerged stone structure whose straight lines and terraces stir debate even now. Some say it is natural, shaped by geological forces. Others see steps, platforms, and corridors too precise to dismiss as accident. If human hands carved it, the implications ripple backward in time, hinting at civilizations more advanced than our current timelines suggest. Yet proof remains elusive, held hostage by waves, and so Yonaguni exists in a liminal state, part science, part speculation, an artifact and a riddle at once. The Mediterranean also conceals its share of enigmas. Near Alexandria, divers have uncovered the drowned remains of Cleopatra's palace, toppled by earthquakes and swallowed by rising seas. Columns, statues, sphinxes now rest in the murk, silent witnesses to a city's final collapse. What once stood above, as a stage for power and ambition, now lies scattered across the seabed, barnacles clinging to faces that once symbolized divinity. In this way, the sea is both archivist and editor. It keeps fragments, but never the whole, forcing us to imagine the rest. And then there are older mysteries still. Off the coast of India, at the Gulf of Khambhat, sonar scans reveal geometric structures buried beneath layers of silt. Pottery fragments recovered from the site suggest extreme antiquity, far older than cities we typically call the first. Debate erupted immediately, some calling it evidence of a forgotten civilization, others dismissing the findings as misinterpretation. The ocean complicates everything. It shifts silt, mixes eras, blurs contexts, so conclusions are slippery. Yet the very possibility reshapes our sense of how fragile coastlines are, how easily they are erased from the visible record. Rising seas are not a modern phenomenon. Long before industrial warming, coastlines shifted. The end of the last ice age brought massive floods as glaciers melted, swallowing settlements along shores worldwide. For every city we know today, there may be others lost forever beneath waters that rose thousands of years ago. Myths of floods are nearly universal. The Sumerian epics, the story of Noah, the tales of Manu in India, the flood legends of the Americas and Oceania. These are not only religious or cultural narratives, they may be distant memories of real events, encoded into myth so they would not be forgotten. To dive into these underwater sites is to feel time in a strange way. A temple column encrusted with coral speaks of centuries, even millennia, of submersion. Fish weave through archways where once people walked. Light filters down in shafts, illuminating mosaics or carvings, as though unveiling them for an instant before shadows reclaim them. Unlike ruins on land, which we can approach and study in relative permanence, underwater ruins appear and vanish in moments, depending on currents, silt, and light. They are glimpses, not possessions. Technology once again becomes our ally in extending those glimpses. Sonar mapping, remote-operated submersibles, and high-resolution imaging allow us to chart sites no diver could explore safely. In recent years, entire coastlines have been scanned, revealing drowned landscapes of river valleys, forests, even possible structures. Some archaeologists argue that submerged prehistory may hold keys to understanding migration, trade, and the rise of civilizations. The challenge is scale. Oceans are vast, and what we have mapped is still a fraction. Each discovery is both thrilling and humbling, a reminder of how much remains unseen. There is also an emotional weight to these drowned cities. To imagine a place where people lived, worshipped, and traded now turned into a reef is to confront the fragility of human ambition. We build as though permanence is possible, yet the sea reminds us that coastlines move, that what stands at the edge today may be drowned tomorrow. The ruins we find are not only archaeological puzzles, they are also memorials, silent testaments to lives interrupted by forces beyond control. Stories of Atlantis hover in the background of every underwater discovery. Plato's tale of a lost island civilization, destroyed in a single day and night, has inspired centuries of speculation. Some seek Atlantis in the Atlantic, others in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, or even Antarctica. Whether it was allegory, memory, or invention remains unresolved. But the persistence of the story reflects a deeper hunger, the belief that beneath the sea lie chapters of human history untold. Atlantis may not exist as described, yet its ghost haunts every sonar image, every submerged ruin, every coral-covered column. To descend into the ocean and touch such ruins is to feel both awe and sorrow. Awe at the endurance of stone beneath waves, sorrow at the silence where once there was life. And perhaps a quiet recognition, too, that the line between land and sea is more fragile than we like to believe. Today's coastal cities, glittering with glass and steel, are no more immune to rising waters than those ancient settlements were. The drowned ruins of the past may be mirrors of our own future, warnings whispered through currents. The ocean does not yield easily. It offers fragments, never certainty, and in doing so, it forces us into humility. We may never know with absolute clarity who built what lies beneath, when or why, but perhaps the point is not certainty. Perhaps the point is the reminder that history is not fixed, that it shifts with tides and storms, that it is as alive as the sea itself. And so, the drowned cities remain both presence and absence, both proof and riddle. They tell us that the human story is broader than we assume, that coastlines we walk today may one day be ruins themselves. They remind us that to live by the sea is to live with change, and that every wave against the shore carries not only salt and foam, but also memory, washing fragments of forgotten worlds back toward us. Mountains do not speak quickly, yet they tell stories if you listen long enough. Their layers are books written in stone, pages pressed together over millions of years. Among these layers sometimes are marks that do not belong to geology, carvings, chambers, tunnels carved by human intent. To climb or descend into such places is to step into another kind of archive, one that blends natural monument with deliberate construction. Consider the vast honeycomb of Cappadocia in Turkey, where soft volcanic rock has been shaped into dwellings, monasteries, and underground cities. The most famous of these, Derinkuyu, stretches downward through multiple levels, capable of sheltering tens of thousands. Narrow corridors, hidden wells, and ventilation shafts reveal planning far beyond mere refuge. Entire communities once lived here beneath the earth, protected from invasion or harsh climate. Walking through its tunnels today, with walls worn smooth by centuries of passing hands, you feel both the resilience and the mystery of those who built it. But Cappadocia is not unique. Across continents, mountains conceal similar labyrinths. In the Andes, caves and tunnels link temples and fortresses, weaving through granite as though stone were no obstacle. In Central America, limestone caves are filled with offerings, skeletons, and signs of ritual, spaces where the boundary between natural cavern and human sacred architecture blurs. These places are not mere shelters. They are thresholds, portals into other realms, as understood by the cultures that carved them. One might ask, why go into the earth at all? Why labour to hollow out stone rather than build upon it? The answers vary. Some sought safety, others ritual purity, others the symbolic act of returning to the womb of the earth. To descend underground was to cross into a liminal space, part sanctuary, part tomb, part initiation. In myths from Greece to Mesoamerica, caves were entrances to the underworld, but not always in a sinister sense. They were also places of rebirth, where new life could emerge after symbolic death. There is a tension in these subterranean works. On one hand, they display extraordinary engineering. Cutting passages through solid rock requires patience, tools, and a vision sustained across generations. On the other, they are almost invisible, hidden beneath the surface, their presence unknown until stumbled upon. Unlike pyramids or temples that rise proudly against the horizon, underground complexes conceal themselves, existing in secrecy. They are paradoxical monuments, vast, enduring, and yet intentionally unseen. Legends cling to these places. In Eastern Europe, tales circulate of tunnels beneath mountains, linking distant monasteries or fortresses, stretching for miles in darkness. Some are dismissed as folklore, yet excavations sometimes reveal collapsed corridors hinting at truths behind the stories. In Asia, Buddhist texts speak of hidden chambers within sacred mountains, places sealed away to protect scriptures and treasures until the world is ready to receive them. Whether real or symbolic, these stories add weight to the sense that mountains guard more than stone. Modern exploration brings tools to illuminate what once seemed inaccessible. Ground-penetrating radar, 3D scanning, and remote sensing reveal voids and passages without disturbing them. In Egypt, such technology has hinted at hidden chambers within the pyramids, sparking renewed debates about their construction and purpose. In the Andes, similar scans suggest tunnels linking sites once thought isolated. Each discovery complicates our view of ancient societies, suggesting coordination, foresight, and symbolic intent on scales we have yet to fully grasp. Walking in these subterranean spaces, one becomes acutely aware of sensory shifts. Light disappears quickly. The air is cooler, heavier. Sounds echo differently, each footstep magnified. Torches or electric lights reveal carvings, sometimes crude, sometimes intricate, etched into walls that once pressed upon entire communities. In such darkness, the mind turns inward, imagination sharpened. It is easy to see why these places became sites of ritual. The environment itself transforms perception, stripping away the distractions of the surface. The endurance of these structures speaks to a broader human impulse to engage not only with the visible world, but also with the hidden one. Just as myths tell of underworlds, humans sought to carve their own versions into the earth, tangible reflections of belief. Whether for survival, ceremony, or mystery, the act of tunneling into stone is as much symbolic as practical. It is an attempt to inhabit the invisible, to make the unseen accessible. At times, speculation enters more shadow territory. Some argue that these underground works hint at forgotten knowledge, technologies or purposes lost to time. The precision of certain passages, the scale of effort, the similarity across distant cultures fuel theories of shared origins or influence. Mainstream scholarship often resists such claims, preferring to see each case as local adaptation. Yet the very recurrence of the underground impulse across geography and era suggests something deeper in human nature, a universal drive to seek depth, to hide, to transform stone into sanctuary. These hidden labyrinths also remind us of impermanence. Many lie collapsed, their corridors flooded or blocked, their stories sealed behind rubble. Others are rediscovered accidentally, when a farmer digs a well or an earthquake opens a fissure. Each time the discovery alters our map of history, adding a layer beneath what we thought we knew. It is as though the earth itself chooses when to reveal what it has kept. In a way, mountains and caves mirror the human mind. Surface landscapes show what is obvious, but beneath lie networks of memory, instinct, and imagination. Some passages are open and clear, others collapsed, others still waiting to be rediscovered. Exploring underground cities is not only archaeology, it is metaphor, a reminder that civilizations, like people, have depths not visible at first glance. And so the mountains endure, keeping their secrets. We can measure them, scan them, dig through them, but always there remains something beyond reach. To step into an ancient tunnel is to step into uncertainty, a silence layered not only with rock, but with centuries of human presence now gone. In that silence, imagination becomes the torch, and the question becomes less about what we know and more about what we are willing to wonder. The sea has always been a restless mirror, reflecting both the sky above and the mysteries below. When we look at its surface, we see movement without end, but beneath lie landscapes as vast and varied as those on land. Valleys, ridges, plains, and mountains that never meet the sun. For most of human history, these submerged worlds remained invisible, yet stories of them drifted across cultures like currents that connect distant shores. Legends of sunken kingdoms, vanished lands, and drowned temples emerge wherever coastlines meet the sea. Plato's tale of Atlantis is the most famous, describing a great island power swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars debate whether this was allegory, memory of a real disaster, or imaginative invention. Yet beyond Plato, similar accounts echo across the world. In Indian tradition, there is Kumari Kandam, a vast southern land said to have vanished beneath the waves. In Celtic lore, the kingdom of Ys lies drowned off the coast of Brittany, its church bells still said to toll faintly beneath the water. In Japan, the tale of Ryugu-jo, the dragon palace beneath the sea, preserves a vision of submerged grandeur. These stories may be mythology, yet they hold fragments of memory. Seas do rise, coasts do change. After the last ice age, meltwaters transformed the world. Doggerland, once stretching between Britain and mainland Europe, sank beneath the North Sea. Entire river valleys became seabeds, their forests now ghostly shapes glimpsed by divers. In the Black Sea, evidence suggests a catastrophic flood thousands of years ago, when Mediterranean waters surged through the Bosporus, drowning settlements that had stood for centuries. Such events leave scars in collective memory, later woven into myth. Modern exploration has brought glimpses of structures beneath the waves that reignite old questions. Off the coast of Japan's Yonaguni Island, massive stone formations rise from the seafloor. Terraces, steps, and what appear to be platforms. Some argue these are natural, shaped by currents and fractures. Others see the imprint of human hands, remnants of a civilization lost when seas rose. In India's Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans have revealed geometric patterns suggestive of ancient cities now submerged. Divers exploring off the coast of Cuba have reported similar shapes, though evidence remains fragmentary. Skeptics caution against over-interpretation. The ocean sculpts its own architecture, creating illusions of intention where none exists. Yet the persistence of these underwater enigmas keeps alive the possibility that our history may have chapters erased, not by conquerors, but by tides. The ocean, unlike desert or mountain, does not merely bury, it consumes, erasing details with salt and pressure, until only faint outlines remain. What drives fascination with these sunken worlds is not simply the possibility of discovery, but what they symbolize. They remind us that civilization is fragile, bound to the shifting ground of climate and geography. Entire societies, with their languages, temples, and knowledge, can vanish beneath water, leaving only whispers in myth. They are cautionary tales written not in ink but in drowned coastlines. And yet they also spark imagination. To think of a city lying silent beneath the waves, its streets filled not with footsteps, but with fish, its towers draped in coral, is to enter a dreamscape both mournful and beautiful. Archaeologists and divers approach with tools and science, but part of the pull comes from the poetry of the idea itself. The ocean as archive, keeping safe what the surface world has forgotten. Consider also the symbolic resonance. Water is transformation, a medium of passage. Myths of floods, deluges, and drowned lands are often stories of endings and beginnings, of worlds swept away so new ones can rise. To search for Atlantis or Yonaguni is not only to hunt for evidence of stone blocks or harbour walls, it is to ask whether our present rests on the ruins of forgotten cycles, civilizations erased so thoroughly that only the sea remembers. Exploration continues. Advances in submersible technology, autonomous drones, and sonar mapping peel back the surface of the ocean bit by bit. Vast stretches remain unseen, more alien to us than the surface of the moon. Each discovery, whether geological or cultural, adds to the sense that human history is not confined to land, but extends into spaces long drowned. Off the coasts of Greece and Italy, sunken ports have been found, their pavements intact beneath clear water. In Alexandria, divers swim among statues toppled by earthquakes, the remnants of the great library city lying silent. These are not myths, but tangible remnants, reminders that the boundary between history and legend is sometimes as thin as a tide line. The sea holds both promise and warning. As we confront rising waters in our own era, watching coastlines redraw themselves, we see in myth and archaeology a mirror. What happened before can happen again. Cities thought eternal may one day be names remembered only in story, their streets mapped in absence. Perhaps future generations will speak of our metropolises as we now speak of Atlantis, places of grandeur swallowed by the sea. To dive into these waters is to dive into uncertainty. Every shadow on sonar, every stone formation glimpsed in murky light tempts interpretation. Some will prove natural, others human, others still undecided. But the act of searching itself reflects something fundamental, a refusal to let the past be settled, a desire to see in the shifting depths not only loss but possibility. The ocean is a reminder that history is not fixed but fluid, layered like currents that conceal and reveal by turn. So when waves break upon the shore and legends whisper of drowned kingdoms, we are hearing more than imagination. We are hearing echoes of landscapes once walked, stories once lived, and questions that remain unanswered. Beneath the sea's surface lie worlds both real and mythical, archives of stone and coral waiting for those willing to descend and listen. The journey there is not about certainty, but about wonder, the same wonder that carried sailors across unknown waters, and that still carries us toward horizons we cannot yet see. The search for forgotten worlds is not only about stones, ruins, or fragments buried beneath soil and sea, it is about us. Each time we ask whether a legend might contain truth, whether a myth might carry memory, we are also asking what it means to be human in the face of time. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, but the questions they leave behind linger like echoes. We live surrounded by the achievements of the present. Yet when we stand in front of a weathered monument or read an ancient text, there is a sense that we are standing at the threshold of an older conversation, one that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we are gone. Perhaps this is why ruins fascinate us. A ruined wall does not simply tell us that something once stood. It reminds us that human ambition, however grand, can be undone by forces beyond its control. Earthquakes, floods, shifting climates, or simply the slow erosion of centuries all leave their mark. Yet in the survival of even fragments, there is resilience, a stubborn refusal of the past to vanish completely. The broken statue, the submerged foundation, the shard of pottery, all are voices refusing silence. And then there are myths, stories of floods, sunken cities, skyborne visitors, and lost knowledge travel farther than armies ever could. They move across cultures, reshaped and retold, but they endure. Why? Because they serve as bridges between what is known and what is guessed at, between memory and imagination. A myth may not give us data, but it gives us orientation. It reminds us to look deeper, to question, to resist the easy certainty that what we know is all there is. Archaeology, philosophy, and speculation intersect in these spaces. The archaeologist digs with a trowel, the philosopher with questions, the storyteller with words. Each pursues a different path, but all are driven by the same curiosity. What came before us, and how does it shape what we are? The material record can confirm some things and contradict others, but it never exhausts the mystery. There is always more beneath, both literally in the ground and figuratively in the past. Consider the paradox. The more we discover, the more aware we become of what is missing. Every ancient city unearthed raises the possibility of another, still hidden. Every deciphered text hints at countless others lost to fire, water, or time. In this way, knowledge itself is haunted by absence. We study the past not as a closed book, but as a manuscript with missing pages, gaps that call out for interpretation. This is not a weakness, it is a gift. The unknown invites imagination, and imagination drives inquiry. If certainty were complete, curiosity would fade. Instead, we live in a world where each discovery opens further questions. A fragment of bone becomes a window onto vanished species. A cracked tablet tells of forgotten gods. A submerged ruin forces us to reconsider coastlines and climates. The very incompleteness of history makes exploration possible. Yet there is a cautionary note as well. To imagine is powerful, but to mistake imagination for fact is dangerous. The line between exploration and invention must be walked carefully. Legends can inspire inquiry, but inquiry must remain grounded. Still, even when speculation outruns evidence, it serves a purpose. It keeps the conversation alive. And sometimes, what was once dismissed as fantasy turns out to have been memory in disguise. Troy was once considered mythical, until ruins were found. Flood myths were once thought symbolic, until geological evidence showed cataclysmic floods did occur. The boundary between myth and history is porous, shifting like sand under waves. What then does all this mean for us here and now? Perhaps the lesson is humility. We live in a world of technologies unimaginable to past civilizations. Yet we too are vulnerable to time, to climate, to the unforeseen. Our cities may seem permanent, but so did theirs. One day, future generations may look upon our monuments as we look upon theirs, with wonder, with questions, with the awareness that much has been lost. And perhaps the deeper lesson is continuity. We are not separate from those who came before. Their questions are still our questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What forces shape our destiny? The languages, the tools, the myths may differ, but the human longing to understand remains unchanged. To explore ancient mysteries is not to escape the present, but to see it reflected in a longer mirror. In the end, the past is not only behind us, it is within us. The myths we tell, the ruins we preserve, the questions we ask are part of the same human story. To look for lost civilizations, to wonder about drowned kingdoms or forgotten builders, is to acknowledge that history is not a straight line, but a vast terrain with valleys unseen and peaks obscured by clouds. We walk across its surface, guided by fragments, searching for shapes that might tell us who we are. So when you next hear a story of Atlantis, or see a weathered stone whose carving resists interpretation, or read a myth that feels strangely familiar, remember, it is not only a story about the past, it is an invitation to curiosity, to humility, to imagination. It is an open door through which we glimpse the enormity of human experience, most of it still hidden. This journey does not end with certainty. It ends, if it can be said to end at all, with wonder. The kind of wonder that asks not for final answers, but for deeper questions. For in questions, as much as in discoveries, lies the essence of being human. And so, our exploration pauses here, not because the story is finished, but because it is unending. The past still waits, in stones and stars, in myths and seas, in whispers carried across time. We have only touched the surface. The rest belongs to those who keep asking,